This is Closer by Dennis Cooper. Part 7. Philippe, Make-Believe. Philippe, 43, was so drunk that the bones in his legs seemed to juggle each other. Every step entertained him, though progress was not in the offing. George used to laugh when the older man wobbled like this. To Philippe those were strange little comedies, maybe because they'd grown very infrequent. He moved from the chair by the telephone to his bookshelf, which he leaned against, one palm outstretched across several spines. They were too slim to read, and, at his pressure, receded into the dark at the back of a shelf, where he'd often considered installing a safe. To keep from falling, he grabbed at the frame of an artwork, which held him upright but skidded sideways on its hidden wire, then tilted up at one end like a sinking steam liner, an image the picture resembled at times, though it was abstract. "I like this," Philippe said, "because it is not in my way, but it makes the room change because it is not a burden. I think it is called, but is beautiful whatever I see in it. Now I perceive a sinking ship, because I am drunk, and that is the best of all I have seen." He laughed. "When I was in Paris," he thought. He could only remember one person, a boy named Jan who was Belgian, and spoke in the strange French some Belgians used. Jan and he couldn't communicate, so they'd undressed. Jan was particularly, if not the best, of the... Philippe lost his balance. He clutched at some books, which came loose in his hand, and only managed to keep from collapsing entirely by gripping the arm of the chair with his other hand, while waving the hand with the books until his knees could support his weight. He pulled himself into the chair whose wooden arm had protected him. He looked around the room, which he could barely make out. The boy walked in. He was naked and still kind of damp from the shower. He stared at Philippe for a while, then shrugged and put on his clothes. When he was dressed, the boy said, "I like you. You're strange, but you're nice." At this, he gazed at the walls, not at Philippe. "You're from France," he added. Philippe was about to say where in France, but the boy started talking again. "Are you interested in me? Because I could make an arrangement." Philippe didn't know if he was or not. "Come here," he said. The boy put his hands on his hips and walked over, then bent at the waist so he was close enough to Philippe's to be studied, not kissed. "Men love me," he said, "because I'm reliable." Philippe loved his face when it was indifferent, across a bar, but any expression at all hit his features as hard as an earthquake. "I have someone," Philippe said, "but I know a man who will love you." He wrote down Tom's name and phone number. "When is the best time to call him?" "Tomorrow, or any time," Philippe answered. The boy put the number somewhere on his person. He walked to the door, where Philippe couldn't see. "Oh, I'm Jimmy," he said. "Nice to meet you. Thanks." Philippe checked his watch, then fell into a half-waking state for an hour, occasionally opening his eyes to double-check the room's tidiness. He needed this. When the buzzer rang, he was a fraction more sober, and walked to the door with an obedient, almost refined sweep. "Yes, come in. How are you?" he asked. George bolted past, found the chair he always used, and sat down so hard its supports cracked. "Sorry, I don't know, fine," he mumbled. He drummed his fist on the arms. "It still hurts, but, that's okay." Philippe shut the door, took a seat nearby. "You look tired," he said. "What?" George asked. Philippe smiled reassuringly. George tried to. "No, I'm just nervous. I can't take acid now because it makes it throb, and I'm not used to being, not stoned." Philippe asked if he wanted a drink. "It throbs," George repeated. His eyes became wooden. Philippe stroked the boy's messy haircut. The scalp rubbed his palm in thanks. These gestures, the pressure from either side, felt as unusual to Philippe as the language he'd learned to pronounce. He wondered less what he meant by caressing than why he was wondering. Regaining composure, he asked, "What? How have you been?" George looked relieved. "Oh, I've been kind of better," he said, then went into detail. Philippe could understand George since his English was simple. Still, it had a strange current, circling around and beneath itself. Philippe tuned in. My dad gave up, I guess. I think he thought I'd change or something, and he's busy getting over my mom. So as long as I'm there for dinner, he doesn't care. It's kind of bad, but he doesn't know where I am now. I try not to worry about it. I mean, what Tom did. I know it's my fault. George continued, his lips nearly motionless. Philippe smiled when a pause seemed to warrant warmth, knowing he could agree with whatever George said. The boy longed to speak, and there was nobody else to speak to, in his words, which was some sort of privilege. Philippe felt removed from these intervals. You sound good, Philippe said. George shut his eyes and gripped the chair's arms. Would you tell me something? He asked. See, I have to make a decision. How do you feel about me? I know you thought I was beautiful, and there's the dead thing you do, but why? To Philippe's recollection, George hadn't probed before. Not so much as, what day is it? He peered at his glass for a moment. I think you are beautiful, he answered, knowing those words were correct. And I enjoy what we do. George bit his lip. You don't love me, right? Yes, Philippe said. I mean, no, but I love what we do. George's head dropped an inch. I have to think about us, he cringed, because I'm not sure if we... Shit. Wait a sec. It'll pass. Philippe smiled, but that seemed inappropriate. He took a drink. Philippe watched George plod toward the rain-splattered street. Once, he tripped over a sprinkler head and fell flat on his face. He struggled up, holding his elbow, and vanished behind a hedge. After a brief intermission, Philippe saw him wandering down the street with his thumb out. He thought of opening the window to yell, You are okay, Georges? If he hadn't come with the boy a half-hour ago, he might have splayed on the couch and rerun the best parts of this fall in slow motion. Instead, he sealed the blinds, turned, and lowered his eyes to the spot where George usually lay. The tumble enticed him since it was unreal. It was unreal since he hadn't observed the boy's face as he fell. When Philippe pictured George's expression approaching the ground, he saw pretend pain, the look that would creep over dolls' faces when children left them alone in the dark. George was hurt, but the specifics could be imagined away. Philippe had repaired them, or given himself that impression, by making believe he'd messed up George himself. This cruelty, however imaginary, fell in line with his wishes. He'd focus his eyes on the new wear and tear, and feel very complex. When he looked at the scars, he saw the inside of George, not as cold gray and empty as he preferred it to be, but brightly colored and very disorganized. On the negative side, they'd complicated his feelings for death by defining his view of it. On the positive side, they looked like fireworks. Still, no matter how George had filled up with hieroglyphs, they didn't help Philippe figure things out. Scars merely forced him to stylize his thoughts, until the destruction he saw matched the painstaking beauty he knew in his mind's eye, his tinted lens. He smiled and went into the kitchen, then dampened a few paper towels. He crouched on the living room rug, collecting the usual stray bits of shit, or, as he'd learned to describe them, my smelling salts. That was a phrase used by mothers to indicate something that woke people up. He downed a vodka, his 9th or 10th. When the phone rang, he managed to answer it. Tom was calling to ask. He'd just killed someone new. They discussed that, then Tom asked, How's George holding up? Philippe considered the question. Alive, he said. This led Tom to deliver his typical speech. As Philippe understood it, the points were, 1. Tom realized he shouldn't have done it, but 2. The worst mistake was in letting George live, since 3. The boy knew too much, so 4. Philippe changed the subject. Philippe lay in bed, imagining George's death. He was extremely drunk. His eyes were closed. The world he saw rang with percussion. Skeletons snapped. Blood and entrails exploded on a grand scale, while George, deposited deep in these fireworks, flailed like a tiny, crazed acrobat. Philippe let himself have preposterous thoughts late at night. Sleepiness didn't discriminate. Death seemed a friend, being so far away. Everything else was a fairy tale. The only difference between, say, a pink unicorn and George's death was the chill of the mind that imagined the latter. Still, this particular fantasy nagged him. He'd stroll through the streets, eat, bathe, weed his rose garden, and it would gather strength over his head, an insidious halo, as black as dried blood, glittering with the thunder of snapping bones. It tugged at him like a tornado. He would peer up and see George affixed to its sphere, and the smog made him think of a woodcut he'd seen as a child. It showed every bone in some man's body broken and woven through spokes of a wagon wheel. Hoisted aloft in the Renaissance, they had continued to twirl for Philippe ever since. This was the grave he'd hand-picked for George. It spiraled into the darkness tonight, like a piece of cheap dinnerware covered with jewels, thrown away by a terrified man to recreate the impression of UFOs, or the unknown at least, in the trickier glow of his thoughts. The UFO reached an ambiguous distance. Philippe changed it into a wound. He was looking inside George's body itself, seeing the tiniest thread of its jumble, the way one might study a theater set if the actual play was impenetrable or performed in a foreign language. He thought of a huge, torn-up asshole. It belonged to a boy named Ed. That was before George came into the picture. Ed was unbearably cute, until men had worn him away. They'd fastened him to a treadmill that spun until there was nothing around but a vague outline, smeared with blood. Philippe used to say, "I am going to kill this Ed." He'd meant that. At the moment, he simply pronounced the words, disregarding their meaning, as though he were saying, "Please don't," to the jaws of a lion. A death was beyond his means. He could only squint blearily into its depths, the casual bystander. When he did, he saw a set of teeth, shiny as jewels, puzzled together and hung from invisible wires. It suggested the bones of a frail human body, and gave off an eerie if elegant glow, like a chandelier, though hung so low it blew wildly about in his heated breaths. He lit a cigarette. The bed was soaked with sweat. When he let his mind drift like this, it beautified every idea he had. But while this rendered them livable, their newfound brilliance left sleep's entrance so shadowy. Quick, he thought. Think straight. 2 years ago, Philippe had moved to America. He found its dingiest bars. He paid a series of hustlers to lie very still on his floor and gained a wild reputation. One of his fucks introduced him to someone who then introduced him to someone who'd started a club for men with unusual tastes. Philippe became the 9th member. They'd meet at the ringleader's house every couple of weeks. Each participant wanted to kill someone cute during sex. None had summoned the strength, so they'd formed a committee to solve the problem of their weakness. Ed was the evidence. One of the members had found him in some hole. His ass had no muscle tone whatsoever. It billowed out from his back and was always as cold as ice cream. He'd stumble over. They'd act out scenarios using him as a prop. Then he'd lurch off. Philippe found relative peace through this teamwork. It brought certain haunting ideas into focus, particularly shit. It was their major find. It formed a kind of stumbling block, in one's words, between them and their wish. It was, in another's terms, death's mace. In time, their discussions grew more and more abstract, with references to theological theories and artists' renditions. They lost Philippe, whose grasp of English was basic at best. When Ed became history, Philippe thought of driving an ambulance. One night, a member asked if he could bring someone in to do a film presentation. The vote was unanimous. The man had a backlog of deaths in the can, as he phrased it. He set up equipment and laid out some background. "The boy you're about to see hitchhiked." He'd picked up the hitchhiker, coerced him home, got him drunk, numbed his body with Novocaine, led him into a basement, started the film rolling, mutilated his ass, asked him if he'd like to say any last words, to which the boy had said, "Please don't." Then he'd killed him. The only sound in the room was the clicking projector. Sometimes the clicks and stabs matched for a few seconds. That made the whole thing seem fake. Then the boy made a very bland face. "Is he dead?" someone asked. "No," the man answered. "Not yet. Watch." Philippe was astonished. He found himself drifting away, as one tended to do with pornography, or rather, drifting into the image itself, like a child did when watching cartoons. He'd knelt down a short distance away from them, too shy to join in. His memory fragmented the rest. Philippe could remember hands scooping out bloody intestines. At what seemed a haphazard point, everyone in the room heard a brief, curt announcement. "Now," it said. Philippe knew that word, but he hadn't realized what it meant at first. The film ended. It flapped like a bat. People redid their pants. The place felt cold, just a vague square of yellowish light. It shone on their sweaty faces. The man switched it off, flicked a switch on the wall. On came the table lamps. "What are you feeling, Philippe?" "Tired." "Then you should sleep." "But I am too tense. I keep thinking." "What kind of thinking?" "Well, everything." "Of Georges?" "Some. He represents something I have desired for a long time." "How long?" "Since before I came to America." "Why did you come?" "I came because in my own country I felt afraid." "Of what?" "Everything, but mainly of myself. I was beginning to want what I could not have." "Can you be more clear?" "No. When I try, my beliefs or desires come out beautiful. They are beautiful to me, but I cannot understand them in that form." "You wanted to kill someone." "That is too simple. I thought about killing someone, though I did not know who. My ideas about death are very beautiful, so I wanted to think about killing a beautiful person." "A boy?" "Yes." "And you could not find him there?" "I could not find myself there. I was known as what I am not." "Who are you?" "I am trying to find this out. It is hard. I am driven to do certain things, and I believe they are helping me because they seem strong." "Why Georges?" "He makes me feel something. I do not know this answer." "He has been hurt?" "Yes." "By someone you know?" "Yes." "How would you kill Georges?" "Very slowly, so I could see everything in him and know what he has meant to me." "Would you expect to see yourself in him?" "I would expect to see someone who could answer my questions, looking at me through him." "He would resemble me." "And Tom?" "He is me if I were less alone." "Can you explain that?" "He can kill someone because he knows who he is. He kills someone to make a friend, I think, to know someone else. I would kill, if I could do that, to know myself. We are different, but I understand him." "Why did you share Georges with Tom?" "To compare myself to him." "Have you learned something?" "I have seen small differences, but they are hard to explain. I think he felt hatred for Georges in his hurry to find a friend. I feel something like love for Georges, though I do not know why." "Are you weak?" "Yes." "Would you like to change that?" "I would not know how." "Have you made progress?" "I am beginning to feel there is no answer for me. I am too interested in what is beautiful, and when beauty is not somewhere, I create it. But when something is beautiful, it is impossible for me to understand." "How do you mean this?" "I mean, beauty is powerful. I feel very weak when I see it, or when I create it. No, I cannot explain. Death is beautiful? It is too beautiful to explain. But you try. I must. Why? Because I must know what I love, because it is me. I do not understand. I do not either. You wish to die? No, I wish never to die, but to see myself in death, to know what I am in the answer of death. I am becoming completely lost. Help. I do not know how. You should tell me why I do these things. But I cannot. You know this. Yes. So what will you do now? I think I must sleep and try to forget about everything. Do you think you will do this? No, but I must, and I am nearly asleep.